I've been looking forward to getting back to work on the K&T mill. What I need to do this week is to get this motor out of the base. The primary reason why I want to get the motor out is so I can check the bearings and probably go ahead and replace them regardless. Secondarily, and equally as important, this enclosure in the base is just completely full of dried oil, grease, and chips. But before I can pull the motor out, I need to detension the belt so I can get it off of the drive pulley. Of course, none of this stuff is going to come off very easily, I would imagine. First thing I'm doing here is loosening a lock nut for this tensioning bolt on the end of the motor plate. This plate or base pivots on one side to the right as we're looking at it here, and then is adjusted up or down using the leveling bolt that I'm adjusting right now. So my thinking is if I engage this bolt even further, it will lift the motor up, and then that should loosen enough pressure on the belt to let me get it off. It still wasn't quite loose enough, so I went ahead and turned down that bolt even more. And that gave me just enough that I was able to get it started off of the upper pulley, which you can't see from this terrible camera angle, and the belt came right off. With the belt off, I moved back around to the rear of the motor and use a ratcheting box end wrench to take the rear motor mount bolts off. Now, the front of the motor is also held down to that motor base with two bolts. Looking at this, I don't see a practical way that I'm going to be able to get my hand and a wrench underneath the pulley and the fan in order to get those bolts out.
There's no way I'm going to get to that.
My next thought is can I get this pulley and this fan off? I think if I can get these off, that should give me room to get back behind there and get those other two mounting bolts out. I can see that there are two grub screws, two set screws, in between the pulley and the fan that I'm assuming hold them onto the shaft. Hard to tell from this camera angle, but I have to use a ball end Allen driver in order to get at these set screws. I can't get close to them to get them straight up and down. There's really no easy way to pry these off that's not going to cause either some kind of damage or is just going to be fruitless anyway. I'm fairly certain I'm going to need to use some sort of a puller to get these off of the shaft.
Feel anything.
I can't really see 100% of this space between the pulley and the fan, so I'm feeling around to see if is there something else that I missed.
Nothing on here.
According to the parts diagram, there's supposed to be some kind of a plug on the end of the shaft, but quite frankly, I just don't see it. I can't see the edges very well, so I'm not sure how that would come out. I couldn't see how I was going to get the pulley and the fan off at this point, so at least for now, I'm going to go ahead and put these set screws back in. Well, back to my original idea of just trying to get these motor mount bolts out. Before I can get to one of them, there's this other square-headed bolt that goes through the motor base. I'm not exactly sure what its purpose is. Maybe another tensioning bolt, but it wasn't very tight to start with. But I'm going to go ahead and do what I can to fish that out of here.
I might edit that out. And of course, that fell down inside there too.
Well, that front tensioning screw is out, even though it fell down inside the base. I'll fish that out later. Next, I need to try to get a ratcheting box end wrench underneath there to get the motor mount.
Hell is that?
After what seemed to be hours, I finally was able to get this front motor mount bolt out.
Okay. All right.
With all four mounting bolts removed, I should be able to pull this motor out of the side of the machine. Well, almost. The space is pretty tight in there, and with that belt tensioning bolt in the way, I can't get the motor all the way out, and that's partly due to the wiring box that's on the side of the motor. Using a ratchet and a socket, I will remove this belt tensioning bolt completely out of the motor plate. That should give me plenty of room to pull the motor out of the side of the machine. Now I can pull this motor partway out so I can get to the wiring box. The motor wiring is obviously keeping the motor from being able to be completely removed from the machine. So the first thing I need to do is take off this cover plate on what is commonly referred to as the pecker head on the side of the motor. And this exposes the incoming power wires as well as the 9 wires that attach to the motor windings of a 3-phase motor. Now, my plan has always been to replace the 3 incoming power wires to the motor. So rather than trying to pull the tape off of each of these connections, I'm just going to cut the incoming power wires. I can now loosen the clamp that holds this section of flexible conduit onto the pecker head and remove it as well as the 3 incoming power lines. And now the motor is completely free. I can now pull it out of the side of the machine. I'll put it on this little furniture dolly, wheel it out of the way till I'm ready to clean this mess. As I mentioned before, the motor plate pivots on the right side, and it's retained on those pivot pins with a couple of square-headed screws. So I'll use a wrench here to remove those so I can pull the pivot pins. With the retaining screws removed, I can just use a pair of channel locks to pull out the pivot pins and freeing the motor plate. Now you can see part of the reason why I wanted to get this motor and that motor base out. Just the probably 1/4 inch of grease and muck and chips in the bottom of this machine cavity. I'll use some scrapers to get the bulk of this out, and then use either some kerosene or mineral spirits to go ahead and clean up the remainder of any residue that's left over. So time to start some of this motor disassembly. I want to get this pulley and the fan off of the end of the shaft. There's supposed to be, according to the parts diagram, a plug on the end of this pulley, but I can't really seem to find an edge to get it out. I tried using a thin flat blade screwdriver on the edge, and I made a bit of a dent, but it didn't really seem like anything was going to be pulling out of it. Next, I tried to use an awl to see if I can't punch a hole in it, and that was fruitless as well. Well, with neither of those two things working, I figured I'd try to get a little bit more aggressive. I'd use my Dremel with a cutoff disc and see if I can't at least cut a hole into this plug, and if I can then get a pry bar or something inside the hole and pop it out. I was actually a bit concerned about cutting too deep into this because I really didn't know what was on the other side. Well, throwing a little caution to the wind, after I removed the set screws again, I pulled out the big gear puller and figured I would stick that on here and see if we get anywhere with it. Well, the force from the gear puller finally punched a hole into this plug, which made it a lot easier to pull out the end of the pulley. With the plug out of the way, I can see the center on the end of the shaft. Put the gear puller back on and went ahead and cranked down on it with the impact wrench, and it slowly started to come off. Well, I ran out of thread on the gear puller, so I had to reset the jaws, place it back over top of the pulley, and spin the puller again, and off it came. after it came off, I was able to see that there is a pin here that pins these two pieces together, the pulley and the fan. That pin happens to be directly opposite one of the set screws. I thought about taking this apart, but I really didn't see much of a point in it. And besides, I didn't have a punch long enough that would go through the set screw hole and knock out the pin. So I just left them together. I'm really not sure the proper way to get this motor apart. I do want to clean some of the gunk off of it, expose what fasteners I can see, and try to get maybe a picture of how this thing goes together. There appeared to be these rings around the ends of the bearing caps or the grease caps. I'm not sure which. And I think that might be a decent place to start. The problem is every single one of these screws is stuck. Except for one, I was able to loosen it, but none of the others will even budge.
Yep.
I bought this tool off of eBay, I believe. It's an impact screwdriver, and it's perfect for cases like this. I started with a smaller hammer to see if I can't get it to budge, but quickly moved up to the big sludge. And this is, I think, a perfect tool for this. The way it works is when you hammer on the end of the screwdriver, it forces the bit to either rotate clockwise or counterclockwise depending on how you set it. And as long as I don't hit it so hard that it ends up breaking the cast steel, it should make relatively easy work of loosening these screws that probably haven't been removed since 1940. And with all the screws removed on the front of the motor, this ring just came right off. That ring holds on what looks like a grease cap or some kind of a bearing retainer on the shaft. I'm not quite sure if this needs to come off first or if I should try to take the end bells off first. And I'll just rinse and repeat on the ring here on the back of the motor. Well, I figured it probably can't hurt to try to remove the end bells next. So each one is held on with 4 bolts. Well, the end bells are usually on fairly tight, either tight into the motor main casting or at least with the bearings the way they're pressed in. So this might take a little persuasion. I don't have a brass flat nose chisel, so I grabbed this cold chisel, and I think if I'm soft enough here, there shouldn't be any risk in me damaging the end bell. At least I really hope not. And the last thing I want is for me to knock this thing off and it ends up on the floor. So I'm doing what I can to make sure that I can capture it before it has a chance to fall. And what a mess. The amount of grease in here that squeezed out past the bearings is unbelievable. And it does look like that outer piece is a grease cap or a bearing cap of some kind, and it is full of nasty grease, some of it very, very old and very hard. I guarantee this thing hasn't seen fresh grease in a decade because the grease plugs were all clogged with hardened grease. You could have pumped grease in it all day and it wasn't going to get through to the bearing. Now to turn this around and repeat the same process to remove the end bell on the back of the motor. And this one came off in the same way as the other side. It was actually pretty easy, just taking my time, a few taps here and there on that end bell, and it came right out. And I didn't think the grease problem could be any worse than the other side, but this side was probably 3 times as much grease packed into the inside of the end bell, around the grease cap, and in the motor windings. The grease cap on the front of the shaft did not come out as easily as the rear. I was able to use a small putty knife to get into the seam and separate them enough that I could then pry them apart and pull off the grease cap. And as expected, more of the same old hardened grease on this side. Well, the one good thing and the reason why I'm going to this trouble is I know this motor ran, so I know that the rotor won't be stuck in here, and it came out fairly easily, although, again, just caked in dust and grease. I'm actually really surprised this motor ran. And it does look like I should be able to put a gear puller on these bearing races and pull them off the shaft so I can then press the bearings out of them. I can't see any identifiers on this side of the bearing and the side of that's showing. So hopefully there'll be something on the back that'll let me know what I need to do to find some replacements. Well, I forgot to click record when I did this originally, so please enjoy this reenactment. With the bearing now out of the carrier, I can see there's this, looks like a grease slinger, it might be behind it, and I can now see that these are Hoover 306 bearings. And I just need to find some replacements. Thanks for watching. We'll rebuild this on the next one.